I want this video is to help you sort of think about how we can apply Aristotle. The first video is more theory stuff, sort of showing how it connects happiness to virtue. But this is going to get you thinking more about how we can use him in our ethical thinking going forward. So let's take a look at some of the big things. First, let's start with the riddle. So imagine two teachers, right? One lives very conscientiously, right? Really does a lot to minimize their impact on the environment negatively and does a lot of good things. But they teach, engineering or something, so they don't wind up talking to other students about, or accounting, let's say, and they don't wind up talking to students about these issues. The other doesn't do any of these conscientious things. Pretty negligent when it comes to how much he drives, food he eats, things like that. But tries to keep most of that pretty quiet from his students and teaches philosophy and teaches ethics classes, and so winds up talking to students over the years about ethics and sustainability and vegetarianism. And over the years, he's converted over 100 students to being vegetarians. So if you think about these two teachers from a utilitarian point of view, it seems like the second person is the more morally admirable person because they've actually caused more good outcomes out there in the world. Because if you add up all the things, all the benefits, the 100 people becoming vegetarians outnumber all the good things this one person does in her life. So then you get this question, who's the more moral person? And it seems like that utilitarian answer, that it's the second person, just feels weird. It feels like in some way the other teacher is the person that we admire more. And so this raises the issue of maybe there's a different way to think about morality and ethics. And this is all based on the idea that ethics is really about character. And that's what comes out of virtue ethics in Aristotle, this idea that the goal is to be a good person and to have various character traits that make you a good person. And for Aristotle, being a good person is part of having a good life. One thing that's really interesting about virtue ethics is that it's better, maybe, than utilitarianism or Kant at answering the question, why care? Why do the right thing? So ethics sort of assumes that you want to do the right thing. But a lot of people don't do the right thing. And in fact, your journal entry sort of asks you about this for the week. If you could do the wrong thing and get away with it, would you? And a lot of people say, yeah. Now, what's super interesting about that is that utilitarianism sort of tells you how to think about what's right, but they don't. And it says you should treat everyone exactly like yourself. In Kant, you should treat everybody with respect because they deserve it. But they don't really give you an argument as to, what if you just don't believe that? And then, what then? But Aristotle sort of gives a much more compelling way to think about why we should do what's right or be good people. That for virtue ethics, right, the goal is to have a well-lived life, and part of doing a good job living is doing a good job being a human being. In other words, part of having a well-lived life is being a good human being. And so, why be generous? Because it's awesome to be generous, and it's awesome to be awesome. So, it sort of is an interesting way of getting at that. And you can see this actually gets richer when we think about it even more than this. So, when we think about putting this into practice, character can feel more compelling than thinking about consequences. And I don't like saying this, but it's just true that a lot of the arguments that you've heard over the years about why it's wrong to plagiarize or cheat, and I think students kind of know this, or actually seem a little like BS when you really think about it. So a lot of times teachers say, well, if you take someone else's work, you've harmed them. And, if you really do pull someone's work off the internet, they probably aren't being very much affected. But if you use AI, maybe you're not even taking work from any actual person. And what if everyone's cheating? Or most classes aren't graded on a curve, so even if you're unfairly getting an A, it didn't harm anyone else's chance of getting an A. So it doesn't really harm anyone. And I hear all this all the time, people like, well, I wouldn't steal, but it's Walmart, so who cares, right? Is what you get a sense of is like a lot of the reasons we're often given for doing the right thing, as we get older, we start to realize that they feel a little like BS. And so that, I think, has this dangerous consequence where people can sort of realize, like, that was all well and good when I was a kid. But now that I'm a grown up and I'm in the real world, I just don't give a crap about it anymore. But if you think about it, if you reframe this in terms of character, you get a very different approach, right? So when I ask you, what sort of a person do you want to be? Then, and I ask you the follow-up, do you want to be a person with integrity? That feels real. And then you feel like, yes, I want to be the sort of person who is honest and has integrity. Okay, would cheating on this assignment be part of forming a habit that forms the character of being someone with integrity? Of course not. So then I wouldn't do it. Why? Not because I'm afraid of the consequences, but just because it goes into what sort of a person I want to be. But then, in addition to thinking about this issue of why care and making ethics feel actually compelling to us, we can also think about, okay, fine, I care. How do I use it? Well, there's lots of ways that we can use virtue ethics in our lives. One way we can just do it is what I was just talking about with being a person of integrity, is you could sort of say, what are the character traits that I think are important in being an awesome person? I think it's important to be generous. I think it's important to be compassionate. Okay, well, when I'm trying to figure out what to do, I can ask, well, is this action the sort of action that a generous person would do? Is this action the sort of action that a compassionate person would do? And so we can use it as a guide to thinking about which actions to choose and how to live our lives, because we see it as bound up with who we want to be as a human being. Virtue ethics is also super helpful when we think about social roles. What I mean by social roles, we can think of it as professional roles, but we can also think of it as like, I'm a parent, so I think about this a lot too. I'm a spouse, so I think about that a lot. Like, what are the qualities of a good spouse? What are the qualities of a good parent? Okay, well, I want to have those qualities. What are the actions that help me actually have those qualities, right? And so you can think of examples like nursing. If you think of compassion and attentiveness as keys, you could sort of look at a nurse and say, okay, well, this person is super rude to their patients, that they seem to be failing at being an excellent nurse, even if they have all the technical skills of nursing. You could think of this with teaching or social work, really any profession. What's often interesting in ethics is you have these cases where you have conflicting values of a profession, right? So you might have, there's a case about a social worker who takes one of their clients home and lets them live with them for a little while. So that's very compassionate, but you also, in social work, you should maintain a kind of emotional distance from the people that you are your clients, and so that those seem to jar against each other. We can also apply virtue ethics as a society, right? We can ask, what sorts of characteristics would we want our society to have? So I'll just use the example of the death penalty. And with this example, what I'm hoping you're going to start to see is that as we add theorists, we're sort of adding tools to our mental toolbox so that we can see, oh, wow, there's actually a whole bunch of ways I can think about particular issues in society or in my life. So with the death penalty, one way to think about it is we think about consequences. How much does it cost to execute somebody versus keeping them in prison for life? Would it actually, having the death penalty, does that make it so people are less likely to commit murder? How many innocent people get executed? So that's a very utilitarian approach to thinking about that, because it's all about the consequences. We can also think of a more Kantian way, like, is capital punishment, the death penalty, something that's in line with holding people accountable for their actions? Kant was pro-death penalty because he thought, if you accept this view that, like, it's okay for me to take a life, then you sort of are acknowledging then it's okay for your life to be taken as well. And so we need to hold you accountable for that idea. But there's another way to think about the issue, which is just to ask, what kind of a society do we want to live in, right? So we can say, well, this is a barbaric practice, and we should be more compassionate society. So the United States is on human rights watch lists across the world, primarily because of our use of the death penalty. We're one of the very, very few. I think there's two or three other um, fully modernized countries that are still have the death penalty. So from a global point of view, that's a very barbaric practice, and so we can reflect on maybe it's time to get rid of it, just because that's not who we want to be as a society. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of an overview of how we can use Aristotle, because you've done the first case study. Coming up, you're going to have the second case study. And in the second case study, what I'm going to be looking for is, are you able to show some of these layers of thinking that you can use, maybe Kantian reasoning, Aristotelian virtue ethics reasoning, utilitarian reasoning, to get at some of these complex cases. All right. Looking forward to hearing more from you.